I'm delighted to be making my Labour Party conference debut. I did actually attend once before, arriving late at night in a minibus with the actor, director and Labour Party stalwart Richard Wilson, leaving even later that night. Most of it seems to be blank in my memory, I'm pleased to say, and that is another story. Today, I'm very happy to be here in an official capacity, having been invited to mediate this question and answer session with the Prime Minister, with whom I share a love of books and a degree of sleep deprivation only known to parents of small children. Last time Mr. Brown and I sat down together was in front of an audience a few weeks before he moved into number 10. As we began our conversation in front of a packed tent in Hay-on-Wye at the book festival, a storm of biblical proportions erupted, for which he couldn't really take credit, I suppose. But it did prove an auspicious signal for what was to come in those early weeks: floods, pestilence, terrorist acts. I think they were all discussed in your speech on Monday. So much so that there must have been times when I'm sure Gordon Brown would have preferred to retreat to the relative safety of the Treasury, and then came Northern Rock, when I suspect he was probably very glad he was where he was. Poor old Alistair Darling. It just goes to prove that 3 months is a very long time in politics. This question and answer session is really a chance for you, the delegates, and some members of the public to put your questions to Gordon. For the past 6 days, the Labour Party has been taking questions from the public on their website and filming people here on the streets of Bournemouth, I think. To make it simpler for everyone, I'm going to take questions in groups of 3 from the floor, because otherwise we just won't get very many done. So when you do want to deliver a question, I'm probably going to have to do that old hand-raising thing that we all remember from school, from our brilliant education system. But when you do want to deliver a question, if you could look, you'll see there are microphones in the aisles. If you could walk to one of those microphones and wait to be called there. And also, if you could state your name and organisation before you ask the question, just so we know who we're talking to. Can I also ask for your patience, because of course it's a big room and there's things that have got to be played in as well. And I know that all of you want to get your questions to the Prime Minister, and he wants to hear as many of them as he possibly can. And particularly when it comes to the videos that were recorded and the email questions, I know there will be people who will be disappointed, but we couldn't include everything. Prime Minister, I'll lapse into Gordon shortly, I'm sure. But last time we spoke, it was about your book, Courage, at the Hay Festival, and one of the 8 people that you'd eulogised in that book was Aung San Suu Kyi. See, and I've learnt to pronounce it since Hay, which I'm really quite proud of. Of course, Burma is back in the headlines at the moment, a sort of terrible David and Goliath situation with these brave monks pitted against the military junta there. It's a really pivotal moment in Burma's history. What can we do? What can you do?
Well, when we talked at Hay, I'd written this book, and one of my great heroes is Aung San Suu Kyi. And she's an unbelievably courageous woman. She's been virtually under house arrest in Burma for the best part of 20 years. And I met her husband in Britain, and he died tragically 10 years ago. And I was trying to persuade him to come and speak at the Labour Party conference, and I talked to him about the situation in Burma. And then I came to know the full tragedy of what had happened to that family. She'd gone back to Burma. She was put under house arrest after the junta really just trampled on human rights all over Burma. And she was not allowed even to see her husband when he was dying of cancer. And so the whole family was broken up. She couldn't see her husband. And she has, with huge courage over these last 20 years, under house arrest for most of it, stood up for one of the great principles of our time, and that is human rights for everyone and democracy. And she is the elected leader of the people of Burma.
And she is still under house arrest, though. So is there something? I mean, you feel so sort of helpless. Of course, we can't send in troops, you know, that's a very simplistic answer. But what can we actually do?
Well, the whole world is watching Burma now. And the age of impunity for anyone in that regime who commits crimes against individuals or the people of Burma, that age of impunity is over. And I think what's going to happen is 3 things. One is the European Union our prompting, asking them to do so, will extend sanctions on the Burmese regime. I think the second thing that's going to happen is we want the Security Council of the United Nations to meet immediately, and we want it to send out the strongest message that all the countries of the world, and particularly those countries that can put pressure on Burma, do so immediately. I want Mr. Gambari, who's the UN envoy to the region, to go there immediately so he is ready to both put the views of the world to the regime in Burma. So I would like to see all the pressures of the world put upon this regime now. Sanctions, the pressure of the United Nations, pressure from China and all the countries in the region, India, pressure from the whole of the world. And I believe that that message that is being sent out now, that there will be further sanctions, there will be no impunity for those people who commit crimes in Burma against the people of Burma. And if we could send a message today from this conference that we support Aung San Suu Kyi and all those people fighting for democracy against this illegitimate and repressive regime, then I think that is another sign that the world will not stand by and that this regime is under so much pressure now from all opinion throughout all the world.
Speaking of not standing by, you've been quite a pioneer of the efforts to help the beleaguered people of Darfur and now Chad, where the violence is now crossed over. And as you know, I recently visited the refugee camps there in Chad and saw internally displaced people and also long-term refugees from Darfur who are still suffering daily rape, mutilation, violence. You told a very moving story in your speech on Monday, and unfortunately it was really one of very many stories that I heard when I accompanied these 8 amazing women there. Now, of course, last week Al-Qaeda declared a jihad against any peacekeeping forces that might enter Darfur or Chad. Is that going to affect your resolve to help those people?
Well, I think the stories we heard this week about what's happening in Darfur, they're some of the great tragedies of our time. When you think that 250,000 people have died in Darfur, when you think that 2 million people have been displaced, and when you think that if there is no food aid, then 4 million people are facing famine. And this is, again, one of the great human tragedies of our time. And as I said on Monday, I just don't want us to look back a few years from now like we've got to look back tragically on what happened in Rwanda and say, we should have acted, we could have acted, but we didn't act. And I think what's happened with Darfur is that we've passed resolutions in the past, but we've never followed it up. I think what's amazing about Darfur, and you were part of a group of women, you're telling me, who visited the area, is the number of women in African politics who are now ready to change Africa. And I think in Darfur there are some women who are fighting for human rights in a way that I think is sending a message that old patriarchal systems, old hierarchical systems, which deny women particularly the freedom to participate, are over. And if you go around Africa at the moment, if you go to Liberia, it's a woman president. If you go to Mozambique, it's a woman prime minister. If you go to Nigeria, they've just had a woman finance minister running, trying to sort out the problems of the financial system.
One of the women who accompanied us, Ngozi,
a fantastic woman. And I think the women who are campaigning on Darfur, again, are sending a message. Now, what can we do? What happened in the past was we passed resolutions. What we've now got to do is back up this unanimous UN resolution by a force on the ground. It's got to be the biggest force that has ever been put into Africa, 20,000, African Union and UN. Then we've got to start the political talks. They're going to start during the next month, so they're going to start almost simultaneously with the force arriving. Then we've got to get a ceasefire on the ground as the talks start, and I think that people are really up for that now. We have got to produce a plan that will help the economic reconstruction of this area as well, so that is an offer to the people who are there. The aerial bombings that have been done by the military have got to cease. And then we've got to send a message to the government. If you don't abide by these new resolutions, then there will indeed be further sanctions on that regime. So it's a combination of all these things, and we've got to fight for them.
The hardest thing, of course, is that the notion of the deadline of the arrival of troops is affecting some of the groups there in terms of the violence, because what they're doing now is using this as a last-ditch attempt to gain ground, and what's happening to women and children there is just just extraordinarily bad. So it seems to me it's a matter of some emergency.
And that's why all these things are going to happen simultaneously. I mean, people look at Africa and all these great tragedies. A lot of us were brought up on the poverty and the suffering and the injustices that were perpetrated against people in Africa. And this has been 50 years where things that should have changed have yet to change properly. You know, there's this story about Richard Nixon going to Africa, and he went for the celebrations of the independence of Ghana in the 1950s. It was 1957. And he went to Ghana where Nkrumah was becoming the president. And Nixon, as you know, was a bit gauche in the way he acted, didn't know quite what to do. He'd arrived in this place and there was this independence celebration. And he was going around the crowd and he was saying to people, "How does it feel to be free?" And then he went to the next person, "How does it feel to be free?" And then he went to the next person, "How does it feel to be free?" And the guy said, "How should I know? I come from Alabama." and that was... And that was 1957. And this is indeed, if I illustrate in this way, the tragedy of Africa, that America has got civil rights for blacks in the 1960s. But Africa is still fighting for economic and social rights, and in many cases human rights for its people in 2007. And I think the message that we've got to send out is that we are prepared to back up the struggle of Africans for basic rights, for economic and social freedom and progress. Whether it's in Darfur or Zimbabwe, we are prepared to play our part, but we want to work with the Africans that are fighting for democracy, and we will continue to do so.
Thank you. I know you like a biblical quote, and the Lord giveth and he taketh away. And this week, Peter Mandelson both praised your leadership and then turned around and said that he'd like to see perhaps more substance to your great intentions when it comes to education in this country. And I wondered if perhaps you could put a bit more flesh on those bones for us all.
I think the Labour Party and the Labour government, we are the government of education, because as John Denman was saying this morning, the route to opportunity in our country is through education. And I think what's been announced this morning by Ed Balls, that we will do everything in our power to raise standards in our school, to raise excellence in education, because we want everybody to have the chance to make the most of the potential. We had Louisa this morning, one of the sports athletes preparing for the Olympics, and she said, "I can do anything." You know, she can do it. It is possible. Anything, she said, is possible. And I think for young people, we've got to give this sense that if they make the most of the opportunities of education, everything can happen. And so, in addition to the standards that we are trying to improve in the schools, I also think, and I'll be blunt about this, where a school is failing us in any area of the country and failing the children of that school, it's not good enough. And so, where head teachers or the leadership of a school is not working, then other schools in the area that are working well should be able to say, we'll take over the management of that school. And we've already got 10 schools prepared to say that they're prepared to take over, work with, merge with, and make sure that the education of the children in a school that's not doing well will be advanced by them being prepared to give leadership to that school. So I would say, facing all the challenges ahead, we are a talented country. Everybody has got talent. But we've got to help through education that people make the most of that talent. And that means a campaign for standards on the one hand, and where we are falling behind, we've got to take the action to make schools the best, particularly for people who otherwise would be left behind and in the past were left behind. I think that's our mission for education, because it's not just about individual opportunity, it's also going to make for the success of the country in the future. So education is so important, and it's now excellence in education that we're aiming for. We want to be world-class, and I think we will be.
I think it's probably a topic that many of you have got something to say about, so perhaps I could have a show of hands of people who want to ask a question about education. Maybe we could start with the gentleman over there in the blue shirt, and if he could move to the microphone closest. And could you raise your hands again, because I've got to pick 3 people. Thank you. Maybe the gentleman there in the blazer and the lady over there with the piece of paper in her hand. If you could move to the microphone so that you're ready. Thank you. And we'll do them one by one, straight after each other, and you're going to have to remember each question, okay?
Take notes.
One minute. Just let the lady just get out behind you, because otherwise you'll be disturbed. Thanks. Okay. Thank you.
Roy Hutchman, Richmond CLP. I'm sorry my question is not directly on education, but it's sort of related.
I might make you sit down again. I can be very harsh.
Well, to come here to talk to you this afternoon, I first of all went and spoke to Jeff on the Ordnance Survey stand, because I wanted to have some sort of size comparison. Richmond, North Yorkshire, I find, is 207,776 hectares. The Greater London Authority is 159,471,000 hectares. Put the other way round, Richmond, North Yorkshire is 448,000 hectares larger. The question I want to ask really is about every Labour Party member really contributes and counts. We, in that huge, vast area, have 187 members, of which only about 10 are active, in the sense that they go to meetings. Now, those 10 are the personal contact with Labour Party, for Labour Party, in our villages and in the Dales. We are a rural area, and we are in problems, notwithstanding BSC and Blue Tongue in parts of the country. Farmers and rural communities are really desperately worried. The reason I'm saying this is that we really need to have an acknowledgement and a support from senior Labour Party members, government members, who may well come and talk in our area. We have no elected Labour Party members at any level, county, district or parish, save one. I've almost finished.
No, because I'm kind of eager for the question.
Okay.
Sorry.
The question is, please, can we have support? Can you please, Prime Minister, acknowledge that our 187 members in rural North Yorkshire are important to the party?
Thank you very much, and he will answer you in a moment.
This could be the first time where my answer is shorter than the question.
It could be a historic moment. There was a gentleman over there by the microphone.
Thank you. Prime Minister, Bruce Hogan, prospective parliamentary candidate for the Forest of Dean. With the proportion of pupils on free school meals being a huge indicator and an accurate indicator of the performance of that school, isn't it time that school admission policies prevented the more advantaged from escaping underperforming schools, leaving them to be ghettos for the less advantaged?
Thank you for that question. Go ahead.
Right. Sharon Charity from Devices, CLP, Michael Ancram's constituency, currently. Gordon, Gordon, I've been really inspired, like I'm sure a lot of us have this week, by the proposals that we've got from young people. And particularly this morning, it was fantastic to see you on the stage with Ken and to hear about the Freedom Pass for 11 to 18-year-olds in London. This is about education. We're one of the best proposals we've got is to raise the school leaving age to 18. But I live in Wiltshire, where the Tories control every level of local authorities, and children between the ages of 12 and 18 have no concessions on public transport at all. When we raise the school leaving age to 18, or even before, will you consider extending right across the country, even for those who live in black holes of Tory administration, a free bus service for all children in full-time education?
Thank you very much.
Rob. I think you've seen in the last few years how we've managed to move to a national concessionary bus system for elderly people. And it's certainly something that we've got to discuss in relation to young people. And I take that as a proposal that Alistair Darling can look at for his next... I pass these things to the Chancellor now. It's one of the great opportunities that you have. But I agree with you about youth services. Look, you go around the country, you talk to people in every part of the country, and people just say really two things, and it's pensioners who say it, but it's also young people who say it, that we've got to crack down where there's antisocial behaviour, but let's be honest, there is not enough for young people to do. If in the first part of our government, the great challenge was to make sure that there were proper services for the under-5s, and remember that the welfare state was created in the 1945 and really nothing was done except maternity services, vaccination, and then appear at school at 5, and these have been transformed over the last 5 years. Then think what we could do over the next few years to transform youth services in our country. And I don't mean by youth services that we choose what young people have to do and then blame them for not using facilities that are not really designed for their needs. I think, as Ken was saying this morning, it's facilities and amenities that young people themselves can vote on, can decide about, can choose with youth budgets in each area. So I would like us to get to a situation, yes, where there's far more freedom for young people to travel. You hear that everywhere you go, that it's too costly to do so. But also that the facilities that we can build for young people are facilities that are the facilities that they themselves want and not what an adult or a group of older people think that is best for them. When we had, round the cabinet table, we brought a group of young people in almost the first few days in which I was in the job. And you went round the table, and I was quite surprised by what I heard because they were talking about studios. And all the young people wanted music studios or dance studios or studios that where they could actually have their own entertainment, make their own entertainment. So it's sports, it's studios, it's also, of course, youth centres that people are in a position to use. So regard this as the great next challenge for the provision of services to young people. We've made advances in under-5s and we've got to do more. Let's make sure in every area of the country, by offering and then earmarking a youth budget, even in Tory council areas, they're under the obligation to make sure that youth services are provided. And I believe that we will bring the elderly and young people together. I did one of these citizens' juries about this, and we started with all the old people at one part of the room and all the young people at a completely different part of the room. And the old people were saying, young people, antisocial behaviour. The young people were saying, nobody understands us. But the time the day was finished, by bringing the young people and old people together in the same groups, they were all saying the same thing. Crack down on bad behaviour of a minority, but recognise the majority are well behaved and they deserve the chance to have better facilities. So we're going to do that.
And then there's...
Very briefly on the other two questions, fair admissions policy. I believe we've written into the legislation now the requirement that admissions policy is fair. And I believe people do sense that a school in your own community, with the support of parents in your own community, really is the sort of thing that we should be supporting well, so that people think of the school not just as this school or my school, but they think of it as our school, the school of the community. And at the same time, I also take the point from our friend in Richmond, Yorkshire. I may be one of the very few people who've actually spoken to a public meeting in Richmond, Yorkshire. I think there were 2 people there. And I think the chairman wanted to go to another meeting. But Richmond, Yorkshire, I thank everybody in the rural areas for everything that you do. This is a particularly difficult time for the rural communities. Let's be honest, foot and mouth disease is a real fear for people as a result of what happened in 2001. And I think the way that the farming community has reacted without panic and going about the business of detecting and then trying to isolate foot and mouth is one of the reasons why the foot and mouth outbreak has, on this occasion, which hasn't happened on any previous occasion, been contained, difficult although it is, to one geographical area. And where you've got blue tongue as well as foot and mouth disease, obviously you can understand, particularly at this time of the year when the sheep are coming down from the hills, that there are big problems for the farming community. And we will work with them, the National Farming Unions and others, to make sure that we do, as Hilary Benn, who is probably at this moment, if he's not here, he is here. Well, he
At
has
this
been.
moment, not.
He has been this morning doing. He has been this morning doing a video conference on these issues, talking to farmers, obviously, about the concerns. And I assure you that the concerns of the rural areas and those people who are active in the rural areas, we regard this as something that is the real responsibility of a party that speaks not just for some of the country. The Labour Party, let us be proud of it, we speak for the whole country.
Just before we move on to some video questions, it was just something that I meant to touch on earlier, but I was overexcited. And I was wondering, I know you're not a man who believes in complacency, but you must be feeling quite excited at the moment at the fact that some very prominent members of the two main opposition parties are praising your leadership, certainly more than their own, and perhaps more than they've ever praised anyone.
Well, I mean, our policy has to be, for a government like ours and for a party like ours, I mean, our policy is to reach out. Maybe it's because I'm the son of a minister of the church. My father always taught me that you had to reach out to people and you had to bring people in wherever you could encourage them and then persuade them to support your views. So I will continue with the policy of reaching out to those people who share our views, who believe in a society built on working hard, playing by the rules, fair play, people who believe in our views about British values, people who may have voted for, indeed, are members of other political parties, but now see that the future of this country requires a government that stands for these values. And I believe that everybody here will want us to continue to reach out to anybody who shares our values and say, join us, work with us, share with us the task of building a stronger, fairer Britain for the future.
We'll now take 3 questions that have been recorded on video, and please forgive the sort of pregnant 20-second pause between each one. It's technology, not anyone messing with the technology.
Gordon, my biggest concern is that my son always comes home and tells me that a teacher spends a lot of time dealing with disruptive behaviour in the classroom, time that should be spent teaching. What are you going to do about it?
It's a long 20 seconds.
Gordon, with regards to the horrific events in Darfur, what can this country and this government do to help?
It was a short question and a long pause. Perhaps the gentleman up there would like to help us with a bit.
Gordon, you spoke about GP surgeries and opening them up in the evenings and weekends. That's great for me because I've got 4 children and work full time. When is this likely to happen?
Immediately. We want to move this forward immediately, and we will come forward in the next few weeks as a result of the review by Aridazi, who spoke, as Alan Johnson did, very eloquently and brilliantly to the conference yesterday. We're doing a review of the NHS. One of the priorities is GP hours. If you're trying to go to your GP at the moment, it's not just that the hours mean that out of hours or at weekends it's difficult to see your GP. It's also, if you are going to a GP and want to go at your place of work rather than near your home, it's not easy to do so because the rules are that you can only have one GP. And sometimes there are GP services or doctor services that you could see provided in a walk-in centre, or alternatively, there's some pharmacies that could offer some of the medical services, but they're not able to do so at the moment. So I want people to be able to say, look, I need a particular piece of advice or a prescription or some medical treatment, and there's a range of opportunities for me to be able to get that treatment. First of all, GPs have got to be open at weekends and for longer hours. And I think almost everywhere I go in the country, people say this to me, and I think we can make an advance on that by the decisions we make in the Darcy review in the next few weeks. Then walk-in centres, pharmacies, electronic prescriptions, for example, so that where you go to a GP just to get a prescription, actually that prescription could be electronically given to your pharmacy and you could get it without having to queue up at your GP. Walk-in centres we can approve. There's a number of people wanting to start larger GP surgeries that are surgeries that are a block of GP surgeries. What I was most fascinated also about was what Ara Darzi has been talking about how some of the services we offer can be better improved. He was giving the example of if you have, for example, a gallbladder operation. At the moment, you've got to go to the hospital first, see the surgeon. He then says, you've got to have an x-ray. You go for your x-ray, that's another visit. Then you come back and see the consultant. He says, you've got to have an operation, that's another visit. Then you go into the hospital, have the operation. Then you leave the hospital and come back, and then you've got to go back to get stitches out. If you had, in certain circumstances where there are minor or day operations, the facility to do it in either a larger GP surgery or something like that, then you don't need to have all these different visits. And we could make it a lot easier for people to get the patient care that they need in the future. And that's one of the things that Ara Darzi is looking at. So I believe that we can make it far better for people, particularly people, of course, when it's difficult for them to go to a GP between 9 or 10 and 6 in the evening. So that's one of the big changes. Access to GPs, access to screening, access to cleaner hospitals, all these things, access to checkups where your physical health and preventative health can be one of the great things for the future. And if you go around the country, as we did, and we had the citizens' jury a few days ago in Birmingham, these are the issues that people are raising. They believe in the health service, but they want the personal care that is suitable to their needs at the time that they want it. And that will be something that we, the Labour Party, because we built the NHS, because we believe in the NHS, we will now renew the NHS free of charge, accessible to all, personal to people's needs.
School discipline.
Yeah. I was at a school a few weeks ago to launch the anti-bullying campaign. And I feel very strongly about this, having heard from so many young children, heard from Childline, heard from many of the organisations that are campaigning on this, just how bad a problem that this has become. And sometimes, if you don't act and if you don't speak up and you don't say this is wrong, then there's a tendency to take things for granted. And I think what's been done in the anti-bullying campaign is incredibly important. And I was really pleased that Kelly Holmes, who's one of our great Olympic athletes of this century, is leading the anti-bullying campaign and was there at the school with me. And she's encouraging people to speak up, not to allow bullying to happen, not to allow bullying outside the school as well as inside the school, cyberbullying, any kind of bullying. And I think it's very important that we send out a message that bullying is unacceptable, and so too is the more general disruption in a classroom. And that's why in the last few days, powers have been given to teachers. You exclude a child immediately where there is a problem about disruption in the classroom. You don't allow the education of the other 20, 30 people in the classroom to be affected by that. But at the same time, instead of these kids being excluded and then being out on the streets just causing trouble for themselves and for other people, we place an obligation on parents for supervision. If they don't do it, then there'll be fines. But importantly also, the local education authority, that they get that child within 5 days back into another form of education and supervision, so that we don't have the children just out on the streets almost taking some pride in being excluded. We've got to act to exclude, but then we've got to act to make sure that there's an obligation for supervision to take place. Now, I believe if we take this tough action, then we are sending out a very clear message about what is unacceptable behaviour, but equally it means for all our other children that their education is not going to be disrupted as it has been too often in the past.
And finally, there was a question in there about Darfur, which I know we've already touched on, but it seems to me that there's one word missing when we talk about Burma and Darfur, and that's China.
Mm-hmm. China has got a huge influence on the world now. I was at a meeting in Davos at the World Economic Forum, and all the big companies, the big resources companies, the gold companies, the resources energy companies in Africa, some of the most powerful companies in the world, now getting incredibly worried that all the resources that they used to have are now being bought up by China. And what's actually happening is that China is making it its business to buy up and to control a lot of the physical resources of Africa. And we've got to be absolutely sure that in the same way that we abolished the idea that when you gave aid, you put all these conditions on it, and we removed these obligations on countries. They had to trade with us, they had to sell us things in return for our aid. We've got to be sure that the message goes out throughout the whole international community that to tie aid and to try support to either selling off your resources is not an acceptable thing, and then it's not acceptable either for us to stand back and see, as in Darfur or as in other parts of Africa, human rights abuses and not to be able to speak up about it. So I hope that we can persuade the whole of the international community. The Security Council of the United Nations obviously includes all these major countries to stand up where China has influence in Darfur, and of course China has influence in Burma. And I think it's very important that the message is sent out by us here that we want the whole world to work together and not to divide off into blocks to deal with these problems of unfairness and inequality and injustice that for too long we have failed to act on in either Darfur or in Burma.
We've also received some web questions, but I'm going to stop testing your memory now and just read them to you one by one and let you answer each one individually, just as a special treat.
That's very good of you.
Okay. Joshua Jones, he doesn't say where he's from, but he says, as a young member, I'm presuming of the Labour Party, as a young member, I often notice a high level of apathy for the political system among my peers. What will Labour do to ensure we can get young people engaged and educated about politics?
Well, I think we've got to become a campaigning party. I think one of our greatest moments as a party was in the run-up to Gleneagles, where Tony Blair led the way for us to sign and then agree new resources to meet the Millennium Development Goals. And it said that at that time, 1 in every 3 young people were wearing the wristband of Make Poverty History. And this was an amazing campaign. I say it was amazing because even the Conservatives started to support our proposals on debt relief and on aid and on action for justice in Africa and in the rest of the world. And I think if we could create the same momentum around the campaigns for education for every child in the world, tackling the worst diseases of the world, building for human rights in all the countries where people are deprived of human rights, and at the same time at home running the campaigns on the environment that we do and at its most basic on youth services, I think by being a campaigning party we can actually show that we can make a difference. I think the big change in politics in the last 10 or 20 years is that nobody really expects that politicians from the top or 1 or 2 political leaders can bring about solutions. You've got to listen to the people and involve them and engage them in it. You know, there was a story told 100 years ago about the Treasury, where I used to be the Chancellor, you think I sound relieved? The Treasury was trying to block the Ministry of Defence buying big warships, dreadnought warships. And so the Ministry of Defence wanted 6 dreadnought warships. The Treasury said, as usual, it could only afford 4. And a bright spark in the Treasury said, well, let's put it out to public consultation, and inevitably the public will decide that they support us and they only want 4. And they had this huge public consultation around the country at the beginning of the 20th century. And some of you may remember from your history books what exactly happened. The Ministry of Defence said 6, the Treasury said 4, and the slogan that became popular in the public was, we want 8, and we won't wait. And the Treasury drew the wrong conclusion afterwards. They stopped consulting people for about 100 years. And I think the lesson of every modern political issue, you know, whether it's climate change, or whether it's the battle of hearts and minds to win on security against terrorism, or whether it's simply building stronger communities in our own country, the lesson of the last few years is unless you involve and engage people in building your communities, unless people take some personal responsibility active on the environment, unless people are convinced that they've got to go out and argue against extremism in all its forms, Unless you have people who are prepared to do that and involve and engage themselves, then you don't necessarily get the right policies and you don't necessarily get the right answers. So for young people, I would say what we must do is we've got to listen and learn, we've got to involve and engage, and we have not got to just be a governing party, we have also at all times got to be a campaigning party as well.
I have to slip in there just a little question about Europe. What about the European referendum and a lot of people feeling that they're not being listened to with their opinions on Europe having been promised to speak out?
Yeah, I mean, if we were making a decision on the euro, which was one of the issues before us in the last 10 years, there would be a referendum. If we had the same constitutional treaty that was abandoned, we said there would be a referendum. But we said before the negotiations took place in Brussels a few months ago that if we secured all our objectives, in other words, there was opt-outs for Britain in a range of areas, then there wouldn't be a need for a referendum. It's a bit like saying, you know, other countries joined the euro and it was necessary for some of them to have a referendum. We didn't join the euro, therefore we didn't need a referendum. Equally, on the Charter of Human Rights, we've got a protocol saying it's not justiciable in British law. On justice and home affairs, we've got what's called an opt-in, so we haven't seen a fundamental change there either. On the issue of social security, we've got what's called an emergency brake. In other words, you can stop any decision that doesn't meet the British national interests, so there's no fundamental change there. On the question of security, which was one of the issues, that security issues are going to be transferred to the European Union, it didn't happen, and therefore there's no fundamental change there. On foreign policy, it's unanimity that decides it, so you can only proceed by every country agreeing, so that's not a fundamental change either. And so when you actually look at this amending treaty, the reason that many people don't see the need for a referendum in the continent, it's an even greater reason why people have decided when there was a case for a referendum before, the constitutional concept abandoned, no fundamental change in all the areas where there was actually an issue and where we won in our negotiations the British interest, and it's properly represented by the red lines that we agreed. So that's really the argument about a referendum. If it was the euro, we'd have one, but this is not a fundamental change.
Talk me into it.
There you are. What I do know is we have these negotiations that are taking place at the moment, and we have the European Council, 2 meetings in the next few months, and what we've got to do, and David Miliband and Jack Straw and I are all involved in this, what we've got to do is ensure that our red lines are protected in the detail of the amending treaty, and I'll have to report back to the country, as will David and Jack, about our achievements in that, and people can draw their own conclusions, but I believe that people will see that we've achieved all the British objectives, and when we do so, then we can have a further debate on it.
We're globe-trotting again. Paul Peters from Kingston. Will the Labour government help put a new Zimbabwean president in power?
Zimbabwe is one of the great tragedies. I mean, all the hopes of Africa vested in independence so many decades ago. Zimbabwean independence negotiated at Lancaster House, and then you have this huge tragedy, the abuse of human rights. I mean, I find it amazing to think that for a small country, 4 million Zimbabwean citizens are now living in South Africa alone because they've left the country, been pushed out, or alternatively have no source of income in Zimbabwe. And if there wasn't famine relief being provided by aid agencies, and there are many very brave people who are providing famine relief, then millions of people, millions more people would be facing famine and malnutrition in Zimbabwe. 80% unemployment. I mean, this is a tragedy. And then, of course, the central issue, the abuse of human rights, of the freedom of the press, of the freedom of assembly, of the freedom of speech. Now, that's why I've said we should not sit down at the same table as President Mugabe. That is not acceptable. But as Bill Morris said in a very brilliant speech to the conference yesterday, we will play our part also in helping all those people who want to work together to make sure there is social and economic justice and then political justice also for the Zimbabwean people. And we are ready to play our part in the reconstruction and in the building of a democracy. There must be a democracy restored to Zimbabwe. And we will work with the African Union, President Mbeki, who's trying very hard on this, with the President of the African Union, the European Union, and of course the rest of the world in helping the reconstruction of Zimbabwe. I accept that we, Britain, continue to have responsibilities that we should discharge to Africa and particularly to Zimbabwe, and we will do that.
We're talking about places like Zimbabwe, like Burma, like what's happening in Sudan and things. And to the layperson, the question of the UN just comes up over and over again in one's mind, because it seems to me that they are UN issues, and yet you're being asked about them as though you can personally solve them, or at least Britain can play a major and significant part in solving them. So what is the UN's role?
Well, it's time to reform all the international institutions. If there's one big thing that we can do over the next few years, globally, that would change the face of the world, I think it is to reform the international institutions. You know, in 1945, the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund and also the United Nations were created. And the idealism that surrounded their creation after the Second World War has not been met by the ability of either the IMF or the World Bank to do all the great things that were expected of them. And I think it's now time for us to reform these institutions. We've got no worldwide organization that deals primarily with the environment. It's remarkable that climate change is the great global issue, but you can't point to one international organization that has responsibilities for coordinating efforts to improve the environment. We don't do enough. We don't do enough to provide countries with the support that they need to be strong economies for the future. We don't do enough on the reconstruction of countries that have been faced with conflict. And I believe that we could reshape all our international institutions for the modern world with the same idealism that they had in 1945, but for the different purposes. We've got a global economy, not a national economy. We've got people who move around the world, and therefore there's global mobility where there wasn't. There's global capital, and you need to have institutions that look at what's actually happening as a result of the free movement of capital around the world. All these things require us. We should have the same idealism and vision that happened in 1945, but now to build the international institutions for the global role of the future. And I believe that we, and I think the Labour Party, with its great international history, I believe that we can play a huge part, and I'd like us all to play that part in reshaping the global institutions so we eradicate poverty, illiteracy, hunger, we eradicate diseases, and also make for a safer environment.
From the big world to the smaller world, we're going domestic again, and this is Edward Jacobs from Broxtowe, I want to say. Broxtowe?
Yeah, that's right,
Broxtowe, CLP. And Edward Jacobs says, thank you. As a student youth officer from Broxtowe CLP, I wanted to ask about lack of youth facilities and how we tackle youth crime.
Well, it just shows how the same big issues keep coming up again. You know, the person who sent in on an email or on the internet doesn't know that this was the question also being asked from the conference. And it just shows what some of the priorities are for the future. So I just say to people watching, youth facilities are a priority.
But yeah, one's school discipline and one's actual crime on the streets, I suppose it's that whole sense of unease that people have, that, you know, every kid with a sweatshirt with the hood over his head, his or her head, is a danger to them, I think.
Well, this is such an unfair picture of young people. You know, if you were reading... You know, when you go around the country, you meet so many young people doing so many exciting things. I met young people. One young person started in the youth a service for prisoners who couldn't read stories to their children, and she set up this charity so that she would record prisoners reading stories to their children. And of course, many prisoners were illiterate, and she then helped teach them reading. Other young people who are doing amazing voluntary activities in helping make for sport in their communities, or helping do community activities that just make a total difference to regenerating their community. We had these young people this morning talking about how they were volunteering, some for the Olympic preparations, some to help kids who are in care, some to help teenagers who've been in trouble. And I think, you know, it is absolutely true. There is no weakness in our country today that cannot be solved by the strengths of the British people working together. And that's the party that we are, and that's the country that we want to create.
So you don't think by keeping them all at school till they're 18 and then sending them to the army, that would just solve it?
Well, a lot of people will want to join the army, and you know, we're advertising to recruit people as well, and people who join the army do a tremendous job. But you know, in my own constituency, there's a great scheme, midnight football. And what happens is at 8:30 in the evening, and some of the professional footballers associated with that very successful, very strong football club, Wraith Rovers.
Sorry.
They come and help, and they get young people come, they play football in the evening, and that, of course, is the time when there could be trouble on the streets, but young people are playing sports. I was at a school in Leicester the other day, and they do breakfast football. And so young people are encouraged to come in at 8 o'clock, and they're playing football. There's midnight basketball now. There's a huge number of projects around the country, and we should learn from the success of some so that we can see how we can apply this in all areas. But we need to match that by facilities and amenities so that young people can't say that, you know, there's nowhere to go. We're not really helping them if we cannot provide at least some facilities so that young people have somewhere to go.
How did you fill your time as an idle youth?
Yeah, I had a very strange upbringing in one sense, because some of you know I played sports all the time. I actually wanted originally to be a professional footballer, and then when you can't be a footballer, you want to be the manager. And then, as you know, when you look around the country, if you can't be the manager, you want to be the owner. But and then I went to. Because I was part of an experiment, I went to university at 16, and the first week I was in university, I ended up in hospital because I'd hurt my eye playing rugby, as I was telling people on Monday. It was a very great National Health Service in these days. I spent several years going in and out of hospital to get operations, and some of you may not know this, but this is the 1960s and 70s. In my hospital, at 9 o'clock in the evening, this is the National Health Service, free at the point of need. At 9 o'clock in the evening, and I was only 17, 18 at that time, they would come round with a tray and serve all the patients with drinks.
Drinks?
You could have Guinness, you could have beer. Free beer for all the workers. I mean, achieved in the National Health Service. And
are you promising that again?
And this was a bequest to the hospital. I'm sure it's still going. So you may think I came from a very Presbyterian background, came to university in Edinburgh, arrived in university, and I felt seeing everything around me, the drinking, of course, in the student union, there's a lot of betting and gambling on, all these things happening in the years that you come to university at that time. And I felt like Mark Twain. Mark Twain arrived, and he writes the story of arriving as a young person in the border town of Nevada, the frontier town of Nevada, and finding this place was sort of wild, drinking, gambling, prostitution, everything. And he wrote, "This was no place for a Puritan, and I did not long remain one."
I think perhaps it's time now to get some more questions from the floor, but not about bringing back minibars to hospital wards. My
it's
goodness.
not my vision for the future of the housing.
The lady there in the rose-coloured top, yes, you, and the gentleman there in the black jacket, and this gentleman here in the grey jacket, and then I'll come over to you. So if you hang on, and I'll come back, I promise. If you could take your place at the microphones as before, that's brilliant.
Half the cabinet seem to want to ask questions.
If no, none of you, sorry. Yes, please.
Keighley CLP.
Sorry, could you repeat? We didn't catch your name.
Norma Hodkin.
Norma Hodkin.
I applaud the great strides made in education, but I think we need to foster a different attitude towards jobs. Why are some seen as dead end? I think actually there was a speaker today who spoke about dead end jobs. In the end, someone still has to clean the toilets. Okay, it's about how we perceive the importance of jobs.
Thank you.
Kevin Hutchins, West Aberdeenshire Kincardine Constituency Labour Party. What are your plans for taking your review of United Kingdom constitutional issues out to the people, and particularly to the people of Scotland, the northeast of Scotland and Aberdeen?
Okay, I think that was fairly clear. And this gentleman here.
Pat Donnelly, Community Trade Union. While recognising the need to encourage entrepreneurship in the UK, Prime Minister, can you tell us what you're going to do to end the tax loopholes that allow private equity directors and non-domicile status UK residents to escape from paying tax like the rest of us?
Reverse order, you'll answer him first.
First of all, on the private equity issue, you may know we've set up a review on this. It will report at the time of the pre-budget report, which is in the next few days and weeks. So that matter is being looked into, and whenever there is a loophole that it shouldn't exist, we take action. You know, I may say since 1997 we've closed a massive number of loopholes where they exist. Sometimes it's very difficult to do so because you've got lawyers and accountants who are always trying to find these loopholes. But on this issue of private equity, I can assure you that we will do so. When we came in 1997, we found that under the guise of one set of tax arrangements, the Conservatives had been subsidising a whole range of nightclubs on the basis of a training tax relief. And so these are the sort of loopholes you've got to close down. Private equity, we will deal with the issue when it comes to the pre-budget report. Then on the issue of jobs, Hayley's absolutely right. Every job that is important in our public services and in our service in our economy is a job to be valued. And every person who's working and doing a job and contributing to our country should have a decent wage and should have decent conditions. And that's why the action that we want to take on vulnerable workers is something that is important, not just to the vulnerable worker themselves. It's important for us to show that there is dignity for everybody who works in the economy. So but the one thing I think, however, we as a party have got to also realise is changing around the world is this. We estimate that in the next 10 years, you'll probably have 5 million fewer unskilled jobs in the economy. And you will need 5 million more skilled jobs in the economy. So it's going to be the biggest time, the biggest decade of transformation for jobs and for occupations and for the sort of qualifications you need for occupations that we've ever seen. So if you need only 1 million unskilled jobs and not 6 million unskilled jobs, then we've got to provide more support for people to train to do the other skilled jobs that we need in the future. And it's really as a result of what's happening around the world. And if we don't adapt and change and help people get the qualifications for the future, then it will be very difficult for our economy to be able to ensure jobs for everyone. So everybody is valued. The jobs that you're talking about are jobs that are important in the health service or in other services, and there must be dignity attached to them. But we've also got to recognise that we've got a huge opportunity as a Labour government. The dignity of labour is about increasing the value of labour, about giving skills to people so that they can do the jobs of the future, and that's why we place such an accent on education. And then the issue about Aberdeenshire. I spent all my holidays when I was young in Aberdeenshire, so I know Aberdeenshire and I know Aberdeen, and I know that people will respond to the debate both in Aberdeen and around the country that Jack Straw and others are organising about the future of the Constitution. It comes back to this point I made earlier. People want to be consulted about the big issues, and I believe that we can consult people on fundamental issues affecting our future. Citizens' juries are one way of doing so, but we're going to set up a number of commissions to look at some of the great issues of our time. We're going to hold hearings in different parts of the country. We're going to be an outward-going, a government that listens to what people have to say. And I think in every area of the country over the next few months, you'll see that there'll be a citizens' jury, there'll be a chance to discuss the constitutional proposals we're putting forward, and a chance to engage people. And I want more community power in a whole series of decisions for the future. As you know, Hazel Blears is looking at a new concordat between local and central government, and we want to give people in the communities a right of recall. You see, why shouldn't you have more power as individuals over what happens to your health service in your local area? Why shouldn't you be able to call the police and other people to account for the services that are being offered? And why shouldn't we have more power for local authorities over economic development and over bus services, where you can only make the right decision if you listen to the voice of the people on the ground? And I think we can make quite major changes that will enable local people to make more decisions about the local issues that affect their lives.
We're going to go back to the screen and the 20-minute pause just for a couple more questions.
I'd like to ask about housing. At current rates, I'm going to be at least 40 before I own my own home. How can the government help improve that situation?
Gordon, I have a concern about education. In my daughter's class, there are sadly some children who can't read or write properly, and the teacher spends a lot of time with them. I believe it's holding back the whole class. What can be done about this?
Well, affordable housing is a huge issue. I think it's someone from commercial television that recorded this, because they're waiting for the adverts in the middle and they don't appear.
We haven't got
an intermission. Affordable housing is, you know, if you go around the country, everybody must know this from their own constituency. People saying to us, I can't afford to buy my first house, and I can't afford to get a house in some cases to rent, and I certainly can't afford to move when I need to when the family is bigger. And there's a lot of people, I'm afraid, living in overcrowded accommodation. And housing is a huge challenge. There was a huge movement after the First World War, Homes Fit for Heroes, they called it, to build houses for people. And it was the Labour government in the 1920s that built so many of the houses that were built in the 20s and 30s. Then in the 1940s and 50s, we recognized the need to build more houses, and we were building large numbers of houses, 300,000 houses a year at that point. Since the 80s, the numbers of houses being built have been low. And so we've got to actually build enough houses for people to get affordable houses, to get quality homes, and to be able, of course, to deal with the problems of overcrowding by building houses to rent or to own. So in every constituency of the country, this is not simply a problem of London or the South East. In every constituency of the country, there is now pressure to build affordable housing. Now, I say to Conservative councils, they must respond to the aspirations of people that there are more homes built in their areas. And I think it's very important to send out a message that it's in the interests of not just communities, but in the national interests also, that we build enough homes so that the price of homes, which is influenced by the demand and supply of homes, is one that is affordable and brings housing within people's reach. And that's why we've been trying to look at new ways in which you can build homes that are environmentally friendly, that are therefore sustainable housing in sustainable communities, where we secure energy efficiency and we deal with some of the problems of people who say this is an affront to the environment, this is going to cause real problems. I think eco-towns, and I've been up in the northwest, and there's proposals for eco-towns in Birkenhead and in Liverpool now. I think eco-towns is one way that we can build a lot more houses, new towns, eco-towns, but not at a price of the environment being adversely affected. So what we're trying to do is to move forward with home building. I believe local councils in Labour areas want to do so. I believe we've got a problem with the control of councils in other areas where they're preventing housing developments, and I believe there should be a national debate on this so that the message will be clearly sent out by people that we do need to build more houses. Houses have got to be at a price that people can afford. While we've cut interest rates, it's important to recognise that house prices themselves are high, and we've got to make it possible for people, therefore, to buy their own homes. And as far as overcrowding is concerned, it is a great achievement of the last few years that there are less children living in overcrowded accommodation, but it is unacceptable that there are so many hundreds of thousands of children still living in overcrowded accommodation, and that's why we've made a new decision to spend 50% more on social housing, housing to rent, and to enable local authorities as well as housing association to be part of the process of building new homes for rent as well.
Thanks. And I know we've talked a lot about education already, but perhaps in brief, Catherine's question about teachers having to spend a lot of time with students who need extra help, probably their job.
I was really excited on Monday when I saw, and I didn't expect this, that the press went to see young Max, who I had seen trying to read and reading brilliantly in the classroom in Hackney. And he reminded people that I'd said to him when I was with him, if you practice hard, you can be the best reader in England. And he reported that back on the media on Monday. And I feel very proud that here's a young guy who is now reading because he's had that support. Now, it's not just reading, and it's not even just counting, it's also writing. And if we can intervene early, intervene at 5 or 6, and help young people who are in danger of falling behind, kids that are in danger of being left behind, so that at 11 we're in despair, if we can intervene at 5, 6, and 7 when we see these problems happening. Now, it is expensive because it's one-to-one tuition, but I keep saying, if you can do it in private education, we should insist that it's a service available not just for some, but it's available for all.
Now, I know you could sit here all afternoon quite happily, but other people have got to go and do their jobs. So we've got time. We've got time for 2 more questions. So I'm going to have to be very ruthless. The lady here in the dark jacket and the lady here in the pink top. And that's it, I'm afraid. If you could try and get to the nearest microphone as fast as you can, that would be wonderful.
Prime Minister, if I could return and ask a question on education. Marjorie Broughton from Amicus Unite. I wonder if I could ask you if the government could be bold enough to end the inequality of grammar schools, particularly as exists in counties like Kent. Thank you.
Prime Minister, Rachel Harris. I'm a delegate from Wolverhampton South East. I'm a councillor and I'm chair of Dudley Primary Care Trust. You talked earlier on about every job being supported and valued. And I think that everyone in this room would agree that we're very grateful for all our nurses, doctors and other health professionals that work in the NHS. But what will you do, Gordon, as our Prime Minister, to actually really support and value NHS staff? And how will you ensure that you get to listen to the real views and opinions of those staff?
Well, I've spent more time, I think, in the last few months visiting hospitals and health centres and GP surgeries just to hear what everybody has to say. And Alan Johnson has been going around the country as the new health minister and visiting hospitals, health centres and surgery. Aradazi, in his review, is bringing in doctors and nurses and health service staff from all areas of the country. And I hope the message is going out that you cannot run a modern health service without the commitment and dedication and support, and therefore listening to the views of nurses, doctors, midwives and the staff. And I value them, as I know the whole of the country values the work that they do, and we will listen to what they have to say. And I think the next stage of the health service is going to be this cooperative effort. Yes, we've got big reforms that we're still bringing in, and important reforms that we've got to do, but the emphasis is going to be on this personal care, and that's what it's going to be about for the future. And I think if we listen to what the nurses and doctors say, they will tell us exactly how we can deal with some of the problems of MRSA and C. difficile. They're telling us how we can do more about access, cut waiting times, keep the hospitals in a more secure and safe as well as clean condition, and make sure that aftercare is better. When you talk to the patients, what they say is they want to be treated as people and not as numbers. Patients say they want the time, the doctors and nurses must have the time to be able to talk to them. They want the food as well as the care in the hospital to be of a high quality and a high standard. And they want aftercare in the hospitals to be good. Now, together, which is the great adventure of the National Health Service, together, I think we're in a position to make that National Health Service great. I've always thought, because of what we achieved in Britain in the 1940s, that the National Health Service was the great civilizing achievement of our generation. Compassion in action, I think someone called it, and that is absolutely true. And I think in the next stage of the health services development, valuing staff, the focus on patients, the focus therefore on the personal care and the one-to-one relationships that we can foster, we can make the National Health Service and renew it for this generation in a way that will make us all proud of what we're able to do. I can't give you this assurance on grammar schools. This is a matter for individual communities to vote on. If people decide to vote on it, then that is what decision will be made. But what I can say is the difference between us and the Conservative Party on education is that our interests are all children and all schools, and our interests will always be that those people who are in danger of falling behind are given the support that is necessary so that they can make the most of the potential too. If you can pay for education or for any service, you can get advantages from that. But I believe the whole purpose of having an education service that is our community's contribution to the education of people is that everyone can get the best chances. So just as I had good chances, and that was from the local school and the local secondary school, so too I believe we can create a system where everybody has the best chances. And I think we'll look back again on this generation and say, you know, unlocking everybody's talents is the only way to have a successful economy. It's the only way we can ever be successful in the model. And you'll not do it simply by having resources. You'll not do it simply by your size. You'll not do it simply by having ports and communications and being geographically advantaged, as we were at one point in our history. You will only be a successful country if you use the skills of people to create the high value-added industries and services, and that means you've got to unlock the talents of everyone. So we can indeed be the first generation that unlocks all the talents of all the people, and I believe that is a great mission for our party, and we can achieve it to the benefit of every community in this country.
Prime Minister, it's been a very successful 3 months. It's been a very Gordon. It's been a very successful 3 months. It's been a very successful conference, and I wondered if, in the intimate atmosphere of the conference centre here, you wanted to illuminate me on when you felt would be a good time for an election.
Charming as you are, Mariella. I think the first person I would have to talk to is the Queen.
Darn. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.